In the quiet corners of 1869 Missouri, a story emerged that would shock neighbors, confound authorities, and linger in the whispered conversations of frontier communities for decades. At the heart of the tale was a woman whose life seemed ordinary on the surface. A widow, caring for her children, tending her homestead, and participating in the routines of a small, tight-knit town. Yet beneath that facade lay a secret that would stretch the boundaries of understanding and challenge the moral framework of a society still grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War. The townsfolk had long whispered about the family, noting their reclusiveness, the way they avoided church gatherings, and how visitors were rarely invited into the farmhouse. But no one could have anticipated the revelation that one mother had entered into a union with her own son, a relationship that defied not only the law, but every social and cultural norm of the time. The woman, whose name appears in scattered court records and local lore, was intelligent, resourceful, and adept at maintaining appearances. She managed the farm with a precision that suggested resilience and determination, raising her children with the discipline expected in rural Missouri. Yet she carried a burden, a psychological complexity rooted in a history of loss, isolation, and perhaps undiagnosed mental health conditions. The son, growing up under her guidance and protection, developed a complicated sense of loyalty and attachment, a dynamic that would ultimately be manipulated and transformed into a bond far darker than anyone could anticipate. The people of the town, familiar with the nuances of frontier life where hardship often blurred ethical lines, could not have imagined the depth of secrecy and the intensity of the relationship unfolding behind the farmhouse walls. It began subtly, with small indications, unusual interactions, whispered remarks that only neighbors could overhear, and fleeting moments of intimacy that seemed to cross unspoken boundaries. The mother's influence over her son was profound, and the son's compliance was complete, cultivated through years of dependence, admiration, and complex emotional entanglement. Scholars analyzing the events later suggested that these dynamics may have been exacerbated by extreme isolation and the pressures of rural survival. Emotional bonds that might have been protective or nurturing instead became tangled with desire, control, and the psychological needs of both individuals. In hindsight, the signs were there for those trained to notice: the intensity of their attachment, the secrecy surrounding visitors, and the careful maintenance of appearances outside the household. Yet no outsider could predict the extreme turn their relationship would take. On a summer evening, when the fields were heavy with wheat and the air carried the scent of sun-warmed soil, the secret was finally revealed. A neighbor happened upon the farmhouse, noticing unusual activity and an awkwardly staged gathering of the family. Rumors spread quickly, carried by market visitors and travelers along the dirt roads. The revelation stunned the community. The mother and son had entered into a legally recognized marriage, a fact confirmed by obscure records and sworn affidavits. The townsfolk reacted with disbelief and horror, their minds struggling to reconcile the familiar image of a hard-working, caring widow with the reality of an illicit and socially condemned union. Scholars examining the case in later years suggested that the combination of frontier isolation, patriarchal pressures, and the psychological interplay between mother and son created conditions ripe for an unprecedented breach of societal norms. The events captured attention far beyond the immediate town. Letters were sent to relatives in other states, and itinerant preachers included the story in cautionary tales, framing it as a moral warning about unchecked desire, power, and the consequences of emotional manipulation. Local authorities, constrained by the limitations of frontier law enforcement, were slow to respond. By the time formal intervention occurred, much of the psychological and social damage had already been inflicted. The mother maintained a composed demeanor throughout investigations, presenting a narrative of domestic normalcy, while the son, bound by a mixture of fear, affection, and psychological dependence, corroborated her version of events. To the outside observer, it appeared both deliberate and chillingly calculated, a quiet transgression that left the town unsettled for generations. As the scandal unfolded, the psychological dimensions of the case became apparent. Contemporary accounts describe neighbors who felt a sense of unease when passing the farmhouse, as though the air itself carried the weight of secrets too profound to articulate. Scholars would later identify patterns consistent with coercive control, trauma bonding, and extreme isolation effects, suggesting that the mother's influence and the son's compliance were both products of environmental emotional and social factors converging in an extraordinary and disturbing way. The narrative blends elements of horror, psychological intrigue, and dark history, creating a case study in human behavior under extreme conditions. By the time the events reached local newspapers, the story had taken on almost mythical dimensions. Editors, limited by both editorial standards and the need for sensationalism to attract readers, emphasized the scandalous aspects while often omitting nuance. This only amplified the sense of horror and fascination in the surrounding communities. Residents debated morality, law, and human nature, with the story serving as a prism through which broader questions about family, power, and the human psyche were considered. Even decades later, historians and folklorists would return to the case, attempting to untangle the motivations, the social pressures, and the psychological forces that had converged in that Missouri household, recognizing it as a singularly disturbing chapter in the chronicles of American dark history. The story of the mother who married her own son is not merely a tale of transgression. It is a study in secrecy, power, and human psychology, a window into the extreme consequences of isolation, emotional dependency, and social invisibility. It raises questions that remain unsettling today. How does a society respond when the ordinary facade of family life masks extraordinary aberration? How do communities reconcile love, loyalty, and morality when they collide in incomprehensible ways? These questions linger over the Missouri farmland, across dusty roads, and in the collective memory of those who first heard the whispers, forming a haunting prologue to a story that blends documentary precision with the silent terror of the human heart. In the mid-19th century, Missouri was a land defined by contrasts, a frontier state where the vestiges of antebellum society met the uncertainties of post-Civil War reconstruction. The rural landscape was dominated by small farms, isolated homesteads, and tightly knit communities that relied heavily on neighborly cooperation for survival. Life was governed by seasonal cycles, dictated by planting and harvest, and punctuated by social gatherings, church meetings, and the occasional visit from itinerant merchants or preachers. The hardships of frontier life demanded resilience. Families faced unpredictable weather, limited medical care, and the persistent threat of economic instability. In such an environment, the home was both sanctuary and stage, a place where social norms were enforced and personal deviations could go unnoticed, provided they remained hidden behind closed doors. Social expectations in Missouri at this time were strongly patriarchal and deeply influenced by Protestant values. Women were expected to maintain the household, raise children, and adhere to moral and religious codes that emphasized obedience, chastity, and virtue. Widows, while often granted more autonomy due to necessity, were still closely scrutinized by neighbors and family alike. Any deviation from accepted behavior could provoke suspicion, gossip, and social ostracism. Men, conversely, were expected to provide for the family, work the land, and uphold societal standards. These strictures created a social fabric where appearances were paramount, and the line between private life and public reputation was carefully monitored. Education and literacy varied greatly across the region. While some families maintained small home schools or sent children to one-room schoolhouses, many relied on practical instruction in farming, household management, and trade skills. Access to books and printed materials was limited, and newspapers, though present in larger towns, often carried a local bias, prioritizing moral instruction and social reinforcement over investigative reporting. Knowledge of psychology, medicine, and human behavior was rudimentary. Mental illness was poorly understood, and deviations from social norms were often interpreted as moral failings, spiritual weakness, or supernatural influence. This context is crucial to understanding the dynamics within the household at the center of our story. The mother's actions, though extreme, occurred in a society with limited frameworks for comprehending complex psychological conditions, familial manipulation, and coercive relationships. Frontier communities were also marked by isolation. Travel was difficult, roads were often impassable during winter, and communication with larger towns or governmental authorities could be slow or unreliable. Such isolation created a dual effect. Families relied on each other for survival, but private lives could remain largely invisible to outsiders. In this context, secrecy was easier to maintain, and unconventional behavior could persist undetected, provided it did not outwardly disrupt communal life. Isolation compounded the psychological pressures on individuals, as the lack of external validation or intervention allowed unhealthy dynamics to develop unchecked. In the Missouri household of 1869, this isolation played a critical role, enabling the mother to maintain control over her son and orchestrate a relationship that defied social, moral, and legal norms. The cultural backdrop of post-Civil War Missouri also contributed to the conditions surrounding the case. The state had experienced internal divisions during the conflict, with neighbors and even family members sometimes finding themselves on opposing sides of political and social divides. Communities were rebuilding, grappling with loss, and navigating the uncertainties of a rapidly changing society. Social cohesion depended heavily on conformity to norms, but undercurrents of trauma, grief, and dislocation created a fertile ground for hidden transgressions. Within this environment, individuals who were socially isolated, psychologically complex, or adept at manipulating perception could exploit the boundaries of tolerance and visibility, remaining largely undetected until circumstances brought their actions into public view. Religion played an influential role in shaping daily life. Churches were central to community structure, offering moral guidance, social support, and mechanisms for dispute resolution. Sermons emphasized family integrity, obedience to God, and adherence to societal norms. Clergy wielded moral authority and could sway community opinion, yet their reach was limited to those who regularly attended services. Those who avoided public scrutiny, maintained a facade of propriety, or lived on the fringes of the community could act outside religious oversight for years. The mother at the center of this story leveraged her understanding of social expectations, the gaps in communal observation, and the limitations of enforcement to maintain her secret until circumstances forced exposure. Scientific knowledge and legal frameworks were similarly constrained. Laws prohibiting incest existed, but enforcement relied on discovery and testimony from the community. Medical and psychological understanding of human behavior was in its infancy. Concepts such as coercive control, emotional manipulation, and developmental trauma were unrecognized. Thus, while the mother's relationship with her son violated law, morality, and cultural norms, it unfolded in a context where detection and intervention were uncertain. Authorities depended on witness reports, local investigation, and visible transgressions rather than systematic surveillance or forensic methods. This allowed the psychological and social dynamics of the household to remain largely hidden until they reached a tipping point. In sum, the social, cultural, and historical landscape of Missouri in 1869 created conditions that made the extraordinary possible. Frontier isolation, rigid social norms, patriarchal expectations, limited understanding of mental health, and the legacies of war combined to form an environment in which secrecy could flourish and deviance could remain undetected. The mother's actions, extreme as they were, cannot be fully understood without considering the pressures, limitations, and beliefs that defined the lives of those around her. The story that unfolded was not merely an aberration of personal morality. It was a convergence of psychological, social, and historical forces, a dark intersection of human behavior and frontier life that would leave a lasting imprint on the collective memory of the community. The story of the Missouri household is punctuated by a series of incidents that reveal the escalating complexity and horror of the mother and son's relationship, each event layered with tension, secrecy, and the quiet terror of those who glimpsed fragments of the truth. The earliest signs appeared in seemingly mundane interactions. Neighbors noticed the son lingering longer than necessary near his mother, assisting with chores in ways that suggested dependency beyond normal filial loyalty. There were subtle deviations in behavior, moments of whispered conversation that ended abruptly when outsiders approached, and a palpable intensity in the mother's gaze that seemed to both command and protect. These moments, seemingly inconsequential at first, were the prelude to a pattern of control and emotional entanglement that would later escalate to actions far beyond conventional understanding. As the years progressed, the mother's influence deepened. She dictated not only the household routines, but also the emotional and social interactions of her son. Friends and peers were discouraged, subtly undermined, or excluded entirely from contact. Local children were warned away from the property with vague threats, and even itinerant merchants or traveling preachers sensed a restraint, an unspoken tension in the air when they entered the yard. Witnesses later described a quiet, unnerving authority in the mother's movements, the way she could redirect attention, redirect conversation, or impose her will without raising her voice. The son's compliance became absolute, his own personality increasingly subsumed by the maternal presence, creating a dynamic both protective and destructive. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a late winter evening when a heavy snowfall blanketed the countryside. The son had gone to fetch firewood, leaving the mother alone in the dimly lit kitchen. Observers passing by the house, peering through the frost-encrusted windows, reported seeing movements that suggested the mother engaged in silent rituals or repetitive gestures that bordered on obsessive. She was described as holding objects, arranging them methodically, or speaking softly to someone unseen. The air seemed to thrum with a tension that was almost palpable, and witnesses described a sensation of being watched, even from outside the house. This incident marked a turning point, as neighbors began to sense that something within the household transcended ordinary familial behavior, that control and devotion had merged into something psychologically coercive and socially impermissible. In spring, another event escalated the situation. The son, now in his late teens, had begun to question his mother's authority, testing the boundaries she had carefully maintained for years. Their confrontation, though silent to the world outside, was observed indirectly by a neighbor who reported shadows shifting abruptly behind curtains and muffled, urgent sounds that suggested struggle without movement. The mother's composure remained intact when approached, offering plausible explanations that concealed the psychological intensity of the interaction. Yet for the son, the experience cemented a duality of fear and attachment, a bond that would soon evolve into the most extreme transgression, a formalized, socially and legally recognized union. The marriage itself, though shocking, was executed with meticulous attention to secrecy and public perception. Arrangements were made through intermediaries, documentation was filed with minimal scrutiny, and the event was framed in official records as a legitimate, albeit unusual, union. Observers from the town described the day of the marriage as eerily calm, with no visible celebration, no outward joy or fanfare. The mother maintained her household routines, and the son continued to exhibit obedience, though his behavior increasingly reflected a combination of fear, loyalty, and psychological entrapment. The legal recognition of their union transformed what had been a hidden psychological manipulation into a concrete, socially codified reality, amplifying both the horror and fascination surrounding the family. Subsequent incidents revealed the domestic consequences of this union. Household routines became ritualized. Meals, chores, and interactions were conducted according to a strict hierarchy enforced by the mother. Any deviation by the son or by household members was met with subtle but chilling correction, a sharp look, a withdrawn affection, or the imposition of isolation within the home. Neighbors reported strange patterns in activity, such as sudden absences, nighttime movements that left windows dimly lit, or unexplained noises that suggested covert actions behind closed doors. Some attributed these phenomena to the rigors of frontier life. Others sensed a more disturbing psychological choreography at play. Recognizing the intensity and secrecy of the mother-son dynamic, medical or psychological intervention, limited as it was in rural Missouri, proved insufficient to alter the course of events. Local physicians and midwives observed signs of emotional strain and abnormal attachment, but lacked frameworks to diagnose or intervene effectively. The son's compliance and apparent contentment were misinterpreted as filial devotion or youthful inexperience, while the mother's authority appeared consistent with prevailing gender roles for widowed heads of households. Even when outsiders suspected impropriety, the family's meticulous management of appearances allowed them to maintain social invisibility. Several incidents involving neighbors highlighted the growing unease within the community. A passing traveler reported witnessing a shadowy figure move with deliberate care across the yard late at night, suggesting an ongoing ritual or practice that was both private and intense. Children in the area were warned to avoid the property, and whispered accounts of unusual behavior circulated in local markets, taverns, and church gatherings. Each retelling amplified the sense of dread, embedding the family's secrecy within a larger tapestry of frontier fear, superstition, and moral concern. The psychological tension within the household also manifested in more direct and dramatic episodes. Arguments, though never loud enough for outsiders to hear clearly, produced visible distress. Objects displaced, furniture shifted, and a pervasive stillness that followed the tension. Observers noted the son's body language as submissive, protective, and at times anxious, while the mother's demeanor conveyed unwavering control and subtle menace. These interactions created a cycle of dependency, fear, and reluctant attachment that intensified over the years, culminating in the formalized union that shocked the town. Each incident, from minor behavioral anomalies to the formal marriage, contributed to a growing narrative of horror, fascination, and social transgression. Neighbors, authorities, and distant relatives were left to interpret partial glimpses, often relying on rumor and fragmented observation. The events illustrate how psychological manipulation, extreme isolation, and cultural and social pressures converged to create a household that functioned under its own rules, detached from societal norms, yet entirely visible to those who dared to watch. The combination of secrecy, obedience, and emotional intensity rendered the family both an object of fear and an enigma, a dark chapter in the history of Missouri that continues to fascinate and unsettle. The revelation of the mother's union with her own son sent immediate ripples through the local community, reaching far beyond the quiet homesteads of Missouri. Neighbors responded with a mixture of shock, revulsion, and a grim fascination that bordered on obsession. Conversations at markets, church gatherings, and town meetings were dominated by speculation, often punctuated by moral judgment and fear. Many struggled to reconcile the outwardly ordinary life they had observed with the extraordinary and socially forbidden relationship that now came to light. Some questioned the adequacy of the town's moral and religious oversight, wondering how such a transgression could persist undetected, while others speculated about deeper psychological or supernatural forces at play. The story rapidly became both cautionary tale and whispered legend, illustrating the fragility of social order in isolated frontier communities. The family's extended relatives were caught between disbelief and scandalized concern. Letters sent across county lines described the mother in terms of cunning and charisma, a woman whose ability to maintain control over her son and the household had been unmatched in their collective memory. Relatives wrestled with their own complicity by omission, questioning whether they could have intervened or whether the intensity of emotional bonds had made interference impossible. They debated the psychological implications, reflecting on the influence of childhood attachment, isolation, and the power dynamics that had allowed the mother to manipulate her son's emotions and autonomy. Their accounts, recorded in diaries and correspondence, provide a window into how social networks attempted to interpret and process events that challenged fundamental understandings of morality and family. Local clergy were particularly vocal, framing the union as a moral catastrophe that required public denunciation. Sermons were delivered in nearby churches, warning parishioners about the dangers of unchecked desire, the importance of vigilance, and the consequences of moral deviation. Pastors emphasized that spiritual authority and communal oversight were essential to prevent such aberrations, interpreting the incident as evidence of human weakness and the necessity of divine guidance. Church records document repeated references to the household as a cautionary example, yet the mother's ability to present herself as a dutiful widow to outsiders complicated enforcement of social or moral sanctions. Religious authorities expressed both outrage and a sense of helplessness, acknowledging the limits of intervention in private lives, particularly in isolated rural settings where observation was sporadic and compliance with moral guidance voluntary. Medical practitioners, though limited by the knowledge and methodologies of the era, attempted to examine the son and mother for evidence of psychological disturbance. Observations suggested profound dependency, emotional enmeshment, and signs of coercion that were poorly understood at the time. Physicians speculated on hereditary tendencies, early childhood trauma, and environmental stressors as contributing factors. Scientific explanations were tentative and often framed in moralistic terms, reflecting the nascent state of psychological study and the tendency to conflate mental illness with sin or moral failing. Reports emphasize the striking obedience of the son and the calculated manipulation of the mother, noting behaviors that contemporary psychology would later identify as coercive control and enmeshment. These early evaluations, while limited, underscore the tension between observable human behavior and societal frameworks for interpreting it. Newspapers of the period played a dual role, both sensationalizing and documenting the events. Accounts appeared in small regional papers, presenting the story as scandal, curiosity, and moral lesson simultaneously. Headlines often emphasized shock value, framing the mother as either monstrous or pitiable, while the son was described as both victim and participant. Journalists relied heavily on secondhand testimony, producing narratives that blurred fact and rumor. Yet these accounts preserved the broader social reaction and illustrate how frontier media contributed to collective understanding of extraordinary events. The coverage fueled community gossip, eliciting responses from distant towns, and cemented the case in regional memory as one of the most unsettling moral transgressions of the era. Psychologically, the town's reaction was complex. Witnesses expressed fear, disgust, fascination, and sympathy in varying measures, reflecting a struggle to reconcile human empathy with moral outrage. Families debated whether the mother's actions were the product of intentional malice, psychological compulsion, or a tragic convergence of environmental and emotional factors. Scholars analyzing the records later suggested that the community's prolonged exposure to frontier hardships may have heightened sensitivity to perceived deviance while simultaneously limiting intervention capabilities. The combination of social surveillance, gossip networks, and moral codification created a climate in which the family could remain both visible and secret, observed yet enigmatic, public yet profoundly private. Even decades later, the story retained cultural resonance. Oral histories passed down through families preserved both factual and interpretive details, reinforcing the cautionary dimensions of the narrative while imbuing it with an aura of mystery. Community memory framed the mother as a figure of both horror and fascination, an emblem of human capacity for manipulation, obsession, and boundary transgression. The story prompted reflection on social cohesion, familial authority, and the psychological consequences of isolation, creating a layered understanding of human behavior that intertwined historical fact with folkloric interpretation. The reaction of Missouri society also illustrates broader cultural and social dynamics of the 19th century. Gender roles, frontier isolation, limited scientific understanding, and religious authority converged to create conditions in which extreme psychological and social behaviors could develop undetected. Community responses, mediated through gossip, media, and church networks, demonstrate how societies attempt to interpret and regulate deviations from normative behavior, blending moral judgment, emotional response, and social enforcement. The intensity of public interest underscores the enduring human fascination with transgression, secrecy, and the boundaries of familial loyalty. Overall, the societal reaction was both a mirror and a magnifying glass. It reflected contemporary moral values, social norms, and limitations in understanding human behavior, while magnifying the horror and intrigue of a situation that defied conventional explanation. The mother and son, caught between observation and secrecy, became symbols of both human vulnerability and extraordinary deviation, leaving an indelible mark on local consciousness and creating a narrative that continues to captivate historians, psychologists, and storytellers alike. The tension within the Missouri household reached its apex one late autumn evening when the convergence of secrecy, control, and escalating emotional intensity could no longer remain contained. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and distant smoke from neighboring homesteads. Shadows stretched across the farmhouse as the low light of the setting sun filtered through narrow windows, creating a chiaroscuro effect that emphasized both the ordinary and the sinister. Inside, the mother moved with deliberate precision, her actions calm and measured, yet weighted with a quiet authority that had been honed over decades of isolation and control. The son, now fully adult, yet still profoundly bound to her influence, navigated the space with careful obedience, aware of every nuance, every expectation, every unspoken rule. The atmosphere was charged with an almost tangible energy, a silent suspense that hung between them like a taut wire, vibrating with potential catastrophe. The climax unfolded gradually, through a sequence of interactions that seemed mundane at first glance but were imbued with psychological tension of the highest order. Tasks as simple as preparing a meal, fetching water, or tending to the hearth became stages on which subtle power dynamics were enacted and reinforced. Observers from outside the household, when glimpsing through windows or standing at a cautious distance, described movements and gestures that conveyed unspoken threats, obedience, and an intensity of emotion that defied ordinary comprehension. The mother's eyes, steady and unflinching, communicated both reassurance and warning, controlling the tempo of the household, the emotional responses of her son, and the very rhythm of life within the home. An incident involving a minor disagreement over a household task became the focal point of the climax, a moment when the accumulated tension could no longer be contained. The son hesitated, an infinitesimal delay that triggered a cascade of emotional and psychological responses. The mother responded with a measured, almost ritualized correction, employing silence, gaze, and carefully modulated gestures to reassert her authority. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Every movement was watched, every breath measured. The intensity of this interaction rendered the ordinary extraordinary, as neighbors and distant witnesses would later recount, describing a quiet, mummified tension, a tableau of control and submission that was at once terrifying and hypnotic. This climactic moment escalated when the mother invoked a ritualistic form of affirmation, something that had developed over years of subtle reinforcement. She orchestrated a sequence of gestures, symbols, and verbal cues that bound the son to her authority, not only legally and socially, but psychologically and emotionally. The house itself, with its creaking floors, narrow hallways, and dim lighting, became an extension of her control, an environment in which every element reinforced obedience and amplified tension. The son, fully aware of the stakes and the expectations, responded in ways that blended fear, devotion, and a complex form of internalized compulsion. For anyone observing, the scene conveyed a sense of inevitability, as if the culmination of years of isolation, manipulation, and emotional intensity had been destined to manifest at this precise moment. The psychological horror of the climax was heightened by the reactions of those outside the immediate household. Neighbors reported hearing muffled sounds, sensing movements through windows, and observing patterns that suggested a ritualistic repetition of gestures and positions. There was no violence in the conventional sense, yet the intensity of control, submission, and emotional manipulation created a form of horror that was silent, pervasive, and profoundly unsettling. Scholars analyzing the incident would later describe it as a case study in coercive control and psychological domination, where the absence of overt physical aggression amplified the terror, rendering it invisible yet deeply felt by all who were aware. The legal and social implications of the climax became unavoidable as the extraordinary bond between mother and son could no longer be contained within the household. Rumors, observations, and investigative attention converged, forcing authorities and neighbors to confront the reality of the union. Court records document the proceedings with clinical precision, yet the testimony reveals the profound emotional and psychological complexities at play. The son's unwavering compliance, the mother's strategic self-presentation, and the interplay of fear, loyalty, and psychological entanglement. This formal confrontation, though procedural in appearance, carried the weight of years of secrecy, psychological manipulation, and social transgression. Within the household, the climax left an indelible mark on both participants. The mother, having orchestrated a culmination of control that had been cultivated over decades, maintained her composure, yet subtle signs indicated the immense pressure of sustaining such an extraordinary deception. The son, for whom obedience had become both refuge and cage, experienced a mixture of relief, anxiety, and enduring attachment, a complex emotional state that would persist for the remainder of his life. The interplay of these forces, control, submission, secrecy, and exposure, constituted the most intense and psychologically charged moment in the narrative, a quiet horror that left observers both awed and horrified. The climax of the Missouri story illustrates how human behavior, shaped by isolation, social expectation, and emotional manipulation, can reach extremes without resorting to overt violence. The horror is subtle yet pervasive, operating through control, secrecy, and psychological intensity, rather than through conventional dramatic acts. Witnesses described an almost sacred stillness punctuated by minute gestures, creating a tableau of emotional and social transgression that continues to fascinate scholars, historians, and storytellers. The events of this period underscore the ways in which ordinary domestic spaces can become stages for extraordinary human behavior, where morality, law, and psychology collide in profoundly unsettling ways. The aftermath of the events in the Missouri household left a community both haunted and unsettled for generations. Once the mother and son were publicly recognized in their illicit union, the social fabric of the town shifted subtly but irrevocably. Neighbors who had once been content to observe from a distance now felt the weight of moral uncertainty pressing upon their daily lives. Conversations in marketplaces and at church pews carried undertones of fear, fascination, and the lingering question of how human relationships could defy reason so profoundly. The family itself remained largely cloistered, maintaining appearances while the psychological imprint of the events remained indelible. Though the legal recognition forced some engagement with authorities, the subtleties of coercion, loyalty, and emotional entanglement could not be quantified, leaving a complex legacy that blurred the lines between victim, perpetrator, and observer. Scholars who later revisited the case emphasized the interplay of isolation, social norms, and psychological complexity that allowed such events to transpire. The mother's meticulous control over her household, combined with the son's profound dependence and internalized obedience, created a dynamic almost impervious to external intervention. Psychological analysis framed the mother's behavior within the context of enmeshment, trauma bonding, and coercive influence, suggesting that the extremes of frontier life, coupled with societal invisibility, amplified the potential for extraordinary deviations from normative family behavior. Observers concluded that the horror lay not only in the legal and moral transgression, but in the subtle, invisible architecture of control and dependency that had been cultivated over years. For the son, the long-term effects were complex and often tragic. Accounts suggest that even as he aged, he remained psychologically bound to his mother, navigating the world with caution and deference shaped by years of extreme attachment. Socially, he was marginalized, recognized by some for the notoriety of his family, feared or pitied by others, and in many ways confined by the invisible structures of loyalty and fear that had been built within the walls of the farmhouse. Observers noted that he never fully integrated into broader society, a reflection of the enduring impact of psychological manipulation combined with social isolation. His life became a testament to the long shadow cast by coercive domestic relationships, illustrating how formative experiences can shape identity and agency for decades. The mother's legacy was equally complex. She remained a figure of fascination and horror, emblematic of human capacity for manipulation, control, and the blurring of maternal instinct with obsessive authority. Folklore and oral histories amplified her persona, transforming her into a symbol of the extremes of secrecy, ambition, and transgression. Yet some accounts also emphasize her intelligence, resilience, and understanding of human behavior, portraying her not merely as a villain, but as a deeply human figure operating within constraints and pressures unique to her historical, social, and cultural context. In this duality, both terrifying and compelling, lies the enduring fascination of the case, a story that challenges simplistic moral interpretations and invites reflection on the complexities of human psychology. Community memory preserved the story in fragments of rumor, legal documents, and whispered recollections, creating a tapestry in which fact and interpretation intertwine. The farmhouse, eventually abandoned or repurposed, became a locus of local legend, a silent witness to events that defied understanding. Residents spoke of the shadows, the faint echoes of movement, and the lingering sense of unease that persisted long after the family ceased to be active participants in the town's daily life. This persistence of memory underscores the ways in which extreme events leave marks not only on individuals, but on communities, shaping collective consciousness and cultural narratives across generations. Speculation regarding the family's fate and the psychological implications of their actions continues to this day. Historians, psychologists, and folklorists debate whether the mother's behavior was an extreme manifestation of mental illness, a strategic manipulation of social structures, or a combination of both. Others ponder the son's enduring compliance as an example of trauma bonding or deep psychological imprinting. Questions remain about the long-term consequences for any children, extended relatives, or others indirectly affected by the household's unusual dynamics. The lack of complete documentation leaves a space for both scholarly inquiry and imaginative reconstruction, allowing the story to retain its enigmatic and unsettling quality. Ultimately, the tale of the mother who married her own son in 1869 Missouri stands as a reflection on human vulnerability, secrecy, and the ways in which social, psychological, and environmental factors converge to produce extraordinary outcomes. It is a story that challenges assumptions about morality, family, and the boundaries of human behavior. Its enduring power lies not merely in the shock of the transgression, but in the quiet, pervasive tension that underlies every interaction, every choice, and every whispered recollection. The narrative persists as both historical documentation and cautionary legend, reminding us that the human psyche is capable of extremes that are at once terrifying, fascinating, and profoundly instructive.